Behind the legend of Okie from Muskogee lies a family scarred by violence, heartbreak, and secrets. One son was shot and left for dead by a hitchhiker, survived a career-ending car crash, then found God. Another lived as a secret seventh child, working as a trucker for decades before meeting his famous father. The eldest daughter died mysteriously in her sleep just 2 years after Merle's death, possibly from heartbreak. The youngest daughter launched a marijuana business using her father's name, while one son inherited the family empire but struggles with the weight of his father's legacy. Here's what really happened to Merle Haggard's children. Dana Haggard. Dana Haggard's life began under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and it would end in a way that left her family wondering if heartbreak could literally kill someone. Born in 1957, as Merle Haggard's first child with his wife Leona Hobbs, Dana entered the world while her 19-year-old father was sitting in a jail cell, arrested for car theft. This wasn't just bad timing, it was a pattern that would define Dana's early relationship with her famous father for years to come. When Dana was still an infant, Merle made another catastrophic mistake that would separate them even longer. He attempted to break into a diner one evening, not realizing it was only 10 o'clock, and the restaurant was still open with customers inside. After being caught red-handed, he was sentenced to 5 years in San Quentin State Prison. This meant that Dana spent her earliest, most formative years without her father, raised instead by her grandmother in the same converted railroad boxcar that would later become a symbol of the Haggard family's humble beginnings. Growing up as the daughter of an increasingly famous country music star while barely knowing him created a complex dynamic that Dana would carry throughout her life. She and her 3 siblings from Merle's first marriage, Noel, Marty, Kelly, and Noel, formed an unusually tight bond as they navigated their father's absence during his frequent tours and recording sessions. Dana later described their childhood as vastly different from what Merle's youngest children with his 5th wife would experience, saying the 4 older siblings clung to each other during those turbulent early years. Despite the challenging start, Dana eventually found her place in her father's world through music. She became a backup singer for The Strangers, Merle's longtime backing band, and her voice could be heard supporting her father during countless live performances over the years. She also toured with her brother Marty, as part of a group called Marty and Dana Haggard and the Driftwood Band, which performed for 3 years before dissolving. Those who knew Dana described her as outspoken and outgoing, someone who couldn't be in a grocery checkout line without making a friend. Dana married Terry Lemons and settled in Russellville, Arkansas, far from the country music spotlight, but close enough to remain connected to her father's career. She had 4 children of her own, Matthew, Kelly, Jarrod, and Michael, plus a stepson named Austin, and eventually became a grandmother to 9 grandchildren. Despite the physical distance, she maintained a close relationship with her siblings, particularly her sister Kelly, who described Dana as her best friend and said they talked several times every day. The bond between Dana and her father deepened over the years, and she developed a unique understanding of Merle that others didn't always see. During a memorial service in Bakersfield after her father's death, Dana told reporters that, "My dad was a lot deeper than anybody saw," revealing the insight she had gained into the man behind the legendary persona. When Merle Haggard died on his 79th birthday, April 6, 2016, Dana was devastated. Family members noticed that she struggled particularly hard with grief as the 2nd anniversary of his death approached in 2018. Then, on April 10, 2018, just 4 days after that painful anniversary, Terry Lemons left for work in the morning, leaving Dana still asleep in their bed. When he returned home later that day, he found her in exactly the same position, having apparently died peacefully in her sleep sometime during the day. Dana was 61 years old, and her family believes she died of what can only be described as a broken heart. unable to cope with missing the old man, as she had affectionately called her father. Marty Haggard. Marty Haggard has survived more near-death experiences than most people could imagine, and each one dramatically changed the course of his life, in ways that would ultimately lead him away from the country music career that once seemed destined for stardom. Born on June 18, 1958, and named after country legend Marty Robbins, he entered the world while his father Merle was serving time in San Quentin State Prison for burglary, setting the stage for a childhood that would be anything but ordinary. Marty's earliest years were spent living with his grandmother in the same converted railroad boxcar that housed the Haggard family, and his first memories of his father after Merle's release from prison were far from pleasant. Marty later described those early encounters as domestic combat, explaining that his father loved to argue while his mother would escalate things even further, creating what he called a damn circus atmosphere in their home during the 1960s. Despite the chaotic family dynamics, Marty showed early promise in entertainment, initially pursuing acting rather than music during his teenage years. He landed a recurring role on the CBS television drama The Fitzpatricks, and even secured a small part in a movie starring legendary actor Henry Fonda. It was while driving to the filming location of this Henry Fonda movie that Marty's life took its first dramatic turn toward tragedy. As he made his way to the movie set, Marty stopped to pick up a hitchhiker, an act of kindness that nearly cost him his life. The hitchhiker suddenly pulled out a gun and shot Marty at point-blank range before abandoning him in what appeared to be the middle of nowhere. Wounded and bleeding, Marty somehow managed to stay conscious long enough to get back into his car and begin driving, even as he drifted in and out of consciousness from blood loss. He drove an incredible 15 miles in this condition, desperately searching for help, until he spotted a 13-year-old girl who was able to call an ambulance that saved his life. Marty recovered from the shooting, though he later developed a serious infection in the bullet wounds that required additional surgery. The experience might have deterred many people from pursuing a public career, but Marty eventually decided to follow in his father's musical footsteps. He signed with MTM Records in 1985 and began releasing singles that showed real promise, including Trains Make Me Lonesome, which peaked at number 57 on the country charts and would later be covered by George Strait on his 1992 album. His early success even earned him a nomination for Top New Male Vocalist from the Academy of Country Music in 1985. For a brief period, it seemed like Marty had found his calling and was building a solid foundation for a lasting country music career. He spent time in the 1980s touring with his father's band, The Strangers, singing harmonies and playing rhythm guitar alongside Merle himself. However, fate had other plans for Marty Haggard. In 1988, just as his solo career was gaining momentum, Marty was involved in a devastating car accident that left him with severe head injuries and traumatic brain damage. The accident was so serious that it took him nearly 4 years to regain his memory, motor skills, and basic ability to function normally. During this long recovery period, his promising music career essentially ended, and when he finally emerged from his rehabilitation, Marty had undergone a profound spiritual transformation that led him to abandon secular music entirely in favor of Christian ministry and gospel music. Kelly Haggard Patterson. Among all of Merle Haggard's children, Kelly Haggard Patterson has chosen to live the most private life, deliberately staying away from the spotlight that has followed her famous family for decades. Born around 1960 as the second daughter from Merle's first marriage to Leona Hobbs, Kelly experienced a childhood that was marked by uncertainty, frequent upheaval, and the constant absence of a father who was either in prison, on tour, or struggling with his own personal demons during the early years of his career. Unlike some of her siblings who eventually found their way into the music business or public life, Kelly made a conscious decision to maintain her privacy and build a life away from the country music industry. She married and took the surname Patterson, creating some distance from the Haggard name that carries so much weight in Nashville and beyond. Throughout the years, even as her father's fame grew and her siblings occasionally appeared in interviews or performed publicly, Kelly remained largely invisible to fans and media, appearing only at significant family events or during times of crisis. The foundation of Kelly's character and worldview was shaped by what she describes as a dramatically different childhood experience compared to her father's younger children from his later marriages. She has spoken about how the four oldest siblings, IMBO, herself, Dana, Marty, and Noel, formed an unusually tight bond out of necessity during their father's tumultuous early years. As she explained it, their life when they were young was very different from what their father's youngest children experienced, so the four of them clung to each other for survival and support. This sibling bond became even more important to Kelly as the years went on, particularly her relationship with her older sister Dana, whom she considered not just family but her closest friend. The two women talked several times every day, sharing the details of their lives and maintaining a connection that transcended the physical distance between them. Kelly described Dana as someone who was impossible to ignore, outspoken and outgoing, to the point where she couldn't even stand in a grocery store checkout line without making a new friend with whoever was nearby. When Kelly was only 7 years old, her family moved into a 3,600-square-foot house in Bakersfield that would become an important part of the Haggard family story. Decades later, in 2018, it fell to Kelly to speak on behalf of the family when they made the difficult decision to put this childhood home on the market, marking the end of an era for the Haggard legacy in Bakersfield. However, the most devastating moment in Kelly's adult life came in April of 2018, when she received the news that Dana had died suddenly in her sleep. The loss hit Kelly with an intensity that surprised even her, and her raw emotional response revealed just how central Dana had been to her daily existence. When she spoke to reporters about losing Dana, Kelly's words were stark and heartbreaking in their simplicity, explaining that Dana had been her best friend and that they had talked several times every day for years. Kelly described the experience of losing Dana as like having a limb removed, a phrase that captures the physical sensation of grief that goes beyond ordinary sadness. She explained that the loss felt like a fundamental part of herself had been suddenly torn away, leaving her incomplete and struggling to navigate daily life without the person who had been her constant companion and closest confidant since childhood. Noel Haggard. Noel Haggard represents one of country music's most intriguing what-if stories. A talented musician who inherited his father's natural abilities and seemed destined for stardom, but whose career never quite achieved the heights that many expected. Born around 1962 as the youngest son from Merle Haggard's first marriage to Leona Hobbs, Noel grew up in the same challenging environment as his older siblings, shaped by their father's frequent absences and the instability that marked the early Haggard household. From an early age, Noel showed a natural affinity for music that reminded those around him of his famous father's innate talent. He began experimenting with music when he was just 13 years old, drawn to the guitar and songwriting in a way that seemed almost inevitable given his genetic inheritance. Recognizing his son's potential and perhaps wanting to encourage this musical development, Merle made a gesture that would become one of Noel's most treasured possessions and a symbol of his father's belief in his abilities. On Noel's 14th birthday, Merle presented him with an extraordinarily rare and valuable guitar that demonstrated both his financial success and his commitment to his son's musical education. The instrument was a Martin 000 45D Jimmy Rogers-style acoustic guitar, a model that was already considered special among guitar enthusiasts. However, this particular guitar was even more remarkable because it was one of only 150 ever manufactured, making it an extremely limited edition instrument. Even more personally meaningful was the fact that Noel's name had been inlaid in abalone directly into the guitar itself, creating a one-of-a-kind instrument that belonged to him alone. Years later, Noel would recall his father's humor about the gift, explaining that Merle had told him he wanted him to quit playing his guitars and use his own instead. This expensive and thoughtful present reflected Merle's recognition that Noel had serious musical potential and deserved professional quality equipment to develop his skills properly. Noel's talent continued to develop throughout his teenage years and into young adulthood, and he eventually began performing professionally and working on original material. His big break seemed to come in 1997, when he managed to secure what many aspiring country artists only dream of: a major label recording contract with Atlantic Records. This deal led to the release of his debut album, titled One Lifetime, which represented years of work and his best shot at establishing himself as a significant artist in his own right, rather than simply as Merle Haggard's son. The album produced 2 singles that received radio airplay and made it onto the Billboard Hot Country Singles and Tracks chart, though neither achieved massive commercial success. Both songs peaked at number 75 on the charts, which was respectable for a debut artist, but fell short of the breakthrough success that might have launched a major career. Despite the moderate chart performance, Noel's work received some recognition within the industry, and one of his compositions would later be covered by superstar George Strait in 2003, providing validation of his songwriting abilities. However, the late 1990s proved to be a challenging time for new country artists, and Noel's major label opportunity did not lead to the sustained career that many had expected. His time in Nashville's spotlight was relatively brief, and he eventually found himself in a very different role within the family music business, primarily serving as comic relief and support during tours with his much younger half-brother Ben, who inherited their father's band and legacy after Merle's death in 2016. Scott Haggard. Scott Haggard lived most of his life as a secret that even one of country music's biggest legends didn't know existed, creating a story that reads more like fiction than the reality of growing up as the unknown son of Merle Haggard. Born in 1968 in Opp, Alabama, Scott was the product of a brief romantic relationship between Merle and a woman named Lenora. Margaret Bowden, who worked as a jailer for Covington County during the spring of 1968 when she met the already famous country star. The relationship between Merle and Bowden was short-lived, lasting only a brief period during Merle's hectic touring schedule, and when it ended, Bowden discovered she was pregnant but chose not to immediately contact the father. According to Scott's later accounts, someone eventually did get word to Merle that he had fathered a baby boy in Alabama. But the superstar never responded to this information, leaving Scott to grow up without any acknowledgement or contact from his biological father. This abandonment, whether intentional or simply due to Merle's chaotic lifestyle at the time, meant that Scott was raised by his stepfather in Alabama, living what he describes as a completely ordinary life, far removed from the glittering world of country music stardom that his biological father inhabited. Scott has explained that while he always knew Merle Haggard was his father, this knowledge was simply a fact of his existence, rather than something that defined his daily reality or future aspirations. After graduating from high school, Scott made practical decisions about his career path, choosing the stability and honest work of truck driving over any dreams of following in his father's musical footsteps. For years, he spent 5 to 6 days a week on the road, driving an 18-wheeler, hauling loads up and down the East Coast, and building a reputation as a reliable, hard-working driver who happened to have one of the most famous names in country music as his biological father. The turning point in Scott's relationship with his heritage came in 2004, when he was 37 years old and had been working as a trucker for nearly 2 decades. At a Merle Haggard concert, Scott made the decision to approach his father backstage and introduce himself. finally breaking the silence that had lasted his entire adult life. The meeting was awkward and emotionally charged, with Scott telling Merle exactly who he was and watching his father's reaction carefully. According to Scott's recollection of that first encounter, Merle's response was distant and uncomfortable. Scott later described how his father kind of held his head down and said, "Yeah, I remember that," referring to the relationship with Scott's mother, before excusing himself and retreating to the back of his tour bus. This reaction set the tone for what would become a sporadic and emotionally cold relationship between father and son that lasted until Merle's death in 2016. Despite having finally connected with his famous father, Scott found that their relationship remained limited to occasional phone calls and brief backstage visits when their paths crossed during tours. Merle remained standoffish and never fully embraced Scott as part of his family, creating a painful dynamic for a man who had spent decades wondering about his father. In 2006, Scott finally decided to pursue music professionally, teaching himself to sing and play rhythm guitar while continuing his trucking career part-time, performing with established country artists, including Mark Wills, Jeff Bates, and Charlie McCoy. Janessa Haggard Bennett. Janessa Haggard Bennett has surprised the country music world by taking her father's legacy in a direction that nobody could have predicted, launching a cannabis business that honors Merle Haggard's personal marijuana use during his final years, and challenging long-held assumptions about the conservative country music legend. Born around 1989 as the older of Merle's two children with his fifth wife, Teresa Ann Lane, Janessa received her unusual name through what her father described as a vivid dream, in which the name came to him fully formed, leading him to choose it for his daughter. Unlike many of her older siblings who were born during Merle's struggling early years, Janessa grew up in relative stability and comfort, experiencing a very different childhood than the four children from his first marriage who had endured poverty, family chaos, and long separations from their father. This more secure upbringing allowed Janessa to pursue her education and develop her own interests, eventually attending culinary school and learning the business skills that would later prove essential in managing her father's complex estate and various business ventures. As Janessa matured, she took on increasing responsibility for handling much of her father's business affairs, developing a close working relationship with Merle that gave her unique insight into his personal habits and preferences. It was through this intimate family connection that she learned about her father's use of marijuana, which had begun years earlier, on the recommendation of a doctor who suggested cannabis as a way to help the aging performer relax and sleep better during his demanding touring schedule that continued well into his 70s. According to Janessa, her father had been smoking marijuana for more than 20 years by the time of his death, using it primarily to manage the physical and mental stress of performing over 100 shows per year. Even as he approached his 80th birthday, she explained that cannabis helped keep him going and allowed him to maintain the energy and creativity needed for his rigorous performance schedule, contradicting the image that many fans had of the man who once sang the anti-hippie anthem Okie from Muskogee. In 2015, while Merle was still alive, he had already begun working with the Colorado Weed Company to develop what he envisioned as high-quality, connoisseur-grade marijuana strains. This business partnership represented a dramatic shift for someone who had built much of his early career on songs that seemed to oppose the counterculture movement of the 1960s and 70s. However, Merle's attitudes had evolved considerably over the decades, and he saw the cannabis business as a legitimate venture that could honor his personal relationship with the plant. After Merle's death in 2016, Janessa and her husband Brian Bennett decided to continue and expand this business venture, working closely with the Colorado Weed Company to bring their product line to market under the brand name Merle's Girls. The name itself carries personal significance, as Janessa chose it to honor a girls' soccer team that her father had sponsored in California, creating a connection between his charitable activities and this new business venture. The couple continues to live on Merle's 280-acre ranch property in California, where Brian had actually helped his father-in-law grow medical marijuana during the final years of his life. This hands-on experience with cultivation, combined with Janessa's business management skills and her deep understanding of her father's preferences, has allowed them to develop cannabis strains that they believe truly represent what Merle enjoyed smoking during his lifetime. Ben Haggard. Ben Haggard carries the weight of an entire musical legacy on his shoulders, living with the enormous pressure of being not just Merle Haggard's youngest son, but also the heir apparent to one of country music's most influential careers. Born on December 14, 1992, Ben entered the world during his father's later years when Merle had already established himself as a country music icon, which meant that from the very beginning, expectations for Ben's musical abilities were extraordinarily high. Unlike his older siblings who grew up during their father's struggling early years or periods of personal turmoil, Ben experienced a childhood where his father was already a secure, established legend with decades of success behind him. This stability allowed Ben to develop his musical talents in an environment where he had access to professional equipment, experienced musicians, and constant exposure to high-level performances. However, it also meant growing up under the constant shadow of comparisons to one of the most respected figures in country music history. Ben's natural musical abilities became apparent early in his life, and by the time he was just 15 years old, his talent had developed to the point where his father made the remarkable decision to name him lead guitarist for The Strangers, Merle's longtime backing band. This appointment placed Ben in the extraordinary position of performing alongside seasoned professional musicians who had been playing with his father for years, requiring him to meet the same standards expected of veteran performers, despite being barely old enough to drive. The pressure of performing at such a high level at such a young age was intense, but Ben proved capable of handling the responsibility and quickly became an integral part of his father's live performances. He appeared on Merle's recordings and became a regular presence during tours, developing his skills while performing in front of audiences who came specifically to see his legendary father. This unique apprenticeship gave Ben unparalleled experience and training. But it also meant that every performance was inevitably measured against the expectations that came with the Haggard name. When Merle died in 2016, Ben found himself thrust into an even more challenging position as the primary keeper of his father's musical legacy. Rather than simply inheriting money or property, Ben inherited something far more complex: the responsibility for continuing to perform his father's songs and maintaining the connection between Merle's music and his fans. Ben took over his father's tour bus, his band, and essentially his entire operation, continuing to perform the classic Haggard songs that audiences expected to hear. Ben's performances typically consist primarily of his father's most beloved songs, including hits like Okie from Muskogee, Silver Wings, If We Make It Through December, and Mama Tried, along with a selection of classic country covers. While this repertoire ensures that audiences get the experience they're looking for, it also creates an ongoing challenge for Ben as he tries to establish his own artistic identity while serving as a tribute performer to his father's legacy. The emotional weight of this responsibility became particularly evident after his father's death. When Ben spoke about the advice Merle had given him near the end of his life, Ben recalled his father telling him that he would be foolish not to take his guitar and his bus and continue singing his songs for as long as possible, essentially passing the torch to Ben with explicit instructions to carry on the family tradition regardless of his own artistic ambitions.